Welcome. You believe you know the story, don't you? The one spun from starlight and sugar, where a gentle girl in a cerulean gown finds her prince with the help of a bibbity-bobbity-booing godmother and a conveniently sized glass slipper. That tale is a comforting lie, a lullaby crafted to conceal a far more gruesome truth. Forget the pumpkin carriage. Remember the hearth, choked with ash and bone dust. Forget the fairy. Remember the carrion birds. We are not here to speak of Cinderella, the name whispered in gilded halls. We are here to unearth the story of Aschenputtel, the Aschenputtel, a name spit like venom among the cinders. This is not a chronicle of a wish granted by magic, but a visceral account of survival, of a spirit systematically flayed by psychological torment and the monstrous price one must pay to crawl out of a living grave. The fantasy is over. The nightmare is about to begin. Her name was Ella, and her soul was a hollowed-out thing, yearning to be filled with the one substance the world had denied her, a mother's love. The ghost of her true mother lingered not as a comfort, but as an aching phantom limb, a memory of warmth in a house that had become a monument to cold. This profound, gnawing grief was Ella's great flaw, a festering wound that left her pathologically vulnerable. She searched for a reflection of that lost affection in every pair of eyes, making her dangerously blind to the predators who wore a maternal mask. Her hope was not the pure, resilient light of fairy tales. It was a desperate, self-destructive sickness, a willingness to believe any promise, no matter how cruel the source, if it offered even a splinter of the acceptance she craved. She was not naive. She was a survivor clinging to a wreckage that was already sinking into the abyss. The house itself was a co-conspirator in her suffering, a tomb sealed against the living world. The air was thick and heavy, a suffocating tapestry woven from the scent of damp stone, the sour breath of mildew, and the dry, cloying perfume of the stepmother's withered potpourri, which smelled not of flowers, but of funeral wreaths. Silence was the master here, a palpable presence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the stone walls, like a clock counting down to oblivion, or the dry scuttling of unseen things beneath the floorboards. A permanent chill clung to the air, seeping through Ella's threadbare clothes and into her very marrow. Every surface was coated in a greasy film of soot and neglect, and the grand hearth, her prison and her world, was a gaping maw of cold, gray ash, a perfect mirror for the state of her own extinguished soul. The architect of this decay was the stepmother, a creature of unnerving stillness and calculated cruelty. She rarely moved without purpose, gliding through the oppressive gloom with the dry rustle of her dark dress, a sound like dead leaves skittering across a forgotten grave. Her horror was not in shrieks or overt rage, but in the chilling minutiae of her presence. Her fingers were unnaturally long and pale, tipped with immaculate nails that looked like polished bone. She would use them to trace the lines of grime on Ella's face, a gesture that mimicked tenderness, but felt like the caress of a spider, mapping the landscape of her victim's degradation. A faint, sickeningly sweet scent of dust and pressed dead flowers clung to her, an olfactory ghost that announced her arrival and lingered long after she had passed, a constant, suffocating reminder of the rot she cultivated in her home and in Ella's heart. Into this mausoleum of hope, the king's proclamation fell like a stone into a stagnant pool, an invitation to a 3-day festival, a chance for the prince to find a bride. The stepmother, her lips curling into a smile that was a masterpiece of polite malice, turned to Ella. She could go. Of course she could. If she could complete a simple task, pick a bowl of lentils from the hearth's mountain of ash in under an hour. It was an act of pure psychological sadism, a glimmer of impossible light offered only so it could be more brutally extinguished. But Ella's desperate, sick hope surged. She fled to the one place that held any solace, the hazel tree above her mother's grave, and with a voice cracking from misuse, she called to the birds. It was not a sweet song, but a raw, guttural plea, an invocation of some forgotten, wild magic. This was her transgression, not just sorting the seeds, but daring to seek aid, to defy the absolute despair her stepmother had so carefully designed for her. The completion of the task brought no praise, only a tightening of the knot of dread in Ella's stomach. She presented the bowl of sorted lentils, her hands trembling, a fragile blossom of hope pushing through the ash of her spirit. The stepmother merely glanced at it, a flicker of cold amusement in her eyes. It was not the success that interested her, but the flicker of defiance it represented. With a soft, dismissive sigh, she took the bowl and emptied it back into the hearth, this time adding 2 bowls of lentils to the sprawling sea of gray filth. The message was clear. Your hope is a toy, and I will enjoy watching you break it again and again. The impossible task was now doubly so, a sheer cliff face of despair designed to prove the futility of any effort. Once more, Ella fled to the sanctuary of her mother's grave. The second plea was not a request. It was a desperate, soul-deep cry, a surrender to the strange, chthonic forces that seemed to linger beneath the hazel tree. In response, the sky darkened, as if a storm had gathered in an instant. The birds came not as a gentle pair, but as a swirling vortex of black feathers and sharp, hungry beaks. They descended upon the house not like helpers, but like a plague, their collective screeching a symphony of rage that seemed to shake the very stones of the foundation. They poured through the chimney, a living river of shadow and noise, and fell upon the hearth with a frantic, terrifying efficiency, their movements sharp, precise, and utterly unnatural. In minutes that felt like a lifetime of auditory torment, the task was done. The lentils sat pristine in their bowls, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy that had just filled the room. Emboldened by this violent miracle, Ella faced her stepmother for a second time. This time, there was no smile. There was only contempt. "You have no dress," the woman hissed, her voice a low and venomous whisper. "No shoes. You would dance in rags and dirt? You would disgrace us with your filth." Before Ella could utter a word, the stepmother seized her by the arm, her bony fingers digging into the flesh like talons, and threw her into the suffocating darkness of her small scullery, the bolt sliding home with the finality of a coffin nail. Through the wood she could hear them leaving, their laughter like chipping stone. Crushed and abandoned, Ella returned to the one place that felt like home, the cold earth of her mother's resting place. She collapsed beneath the hazel tree, her body racked with sobs that tore from her throat, raw and broken. The grief was a physical poison, a violent purging of the hope she had so foolishly allowed herself to feel. She wept for her mother, for the girl she once was, and for the creature of ash she had become. As her tears soaked into the soil, a strange stillness fell over the small graveyard. The wind died, the night sound ceased, and she felt a tremor run through the roots of the tree beneath her, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Looking up through a blur of tears, she saw it. A single, luminous white bird perched on the highest branch of the hazel tree, its form glowing with a soft internal luminescence against the bruised twilight sky. It was not a creature of the natural world. It moved with a serene, impossible grace. As it tilted its head, something detached from its breast and drifted down, not falling but floating like a leaf on an invisible current. It landed at Ella's feet, a shimmering pool of fabric that seemed to have been spun from moonlight and sorrow. It was a gown, but it held the chill of the grave, a beautiful and terrible omen given form. The dress was cool and heavy in her hands, its texture unlike any cloth she had ever known. It felt like touching liquid light, or perhaps the silken lining of a forgotten crypt. When she put it on, it clung to her skin not with the warmth of a gift, but with the cold, perfect fit of a burial shroud. With the dress came slippers laid gently upon a patch of moss by the bird. They were not glass. They appeared to be carved from solid moonlight, or perhaps crystal formed from a single frozen tear. They were utterly silent, making no sound as her feet slipped into them, and when she walked, she glided over the ground without a whisper, a ghost leaving her own grave for a night amongst the heedless living. The royal ballroom was a cacophony of sensory overload, a loud gilded cage filled with the braying laughter and garish colors of the court. To Ella, who had known only silence and shades of gray, it was a dizzying assault. The air was thick with sweat, expensive perfumes, and the cloying sweetness of wine, a suffocating mixture that made her stomach turn. She felt utterly alien, a specter of quiet sorrow haunting a festival of fools. Every smile seemed a predatory grimace, every whisper a judgment. She moved through the throng not as a participant, but as a silent observer, her uncanny beauty and spectral grace setting her apart, drawing a circle of awe and suspicion around her that no one dared to cross. The prince saw her instantly. To him, she was not a person, but a perfect, pristine enigma, a silent porcelain doll whose mystery he felt entitled to solve. His fascination was immediate and suffocating, his eyes following her with a hunter's intensity. He led her to the dance floor, his touch proprietary, his questions incessant. Ella remained silent, her voice locked away in the quiet misery of her home. She was a beautiful object to him, a prize to be displayed and eventually possessed. His attention was not a kindness, it was a weight, the first bar of a new and more ornate cage being lowered around her. She could feel his desire to own her, to catalog her and pin her down like a rare butterfly. As the final dance ended and the midnight hour approached, a primal instinct for escape seized her. This place, with its bright lights and the prince's possessive gaze, was more dangerous than the familiar shadows of her own hearth. Her flight was not the graceful exit of a mysterious princess. It was the panicked, desperate scramble of a cornered animal. She fled the suffocating warmth of the ballroom for the cold, clean air of the night. Ignoring the prince's calls, she scaled a garden wall and hid herself in the old dovecote behind the palace kitchens, a place of cooing birds, scattered feathers, and the familiar, almost comforting smell of droppings. Here, among the dirt and the animals, she felt safe. Here, she was home. Her stepsisters returned home in a flurry of agitated gossip, their voices sharp and envious as they described the mysterious princess who had captivated the prince. They spoke of her unearthly beauty and her silent, regal bearing, never once suspecting the ethereal creature was the same girl they treated as little more than vermin. The stepmother, however, said nothing. She simply watched Ella from across the room with a new and unsettling intensity. Her dark eyes narrowed in shrewd calculation. A seed of suspicion had been planted, and Ella could feel its cold roots beginning to snake around her, a threat more palpable and immediate than any scolding she had ever received. The next evening, the dreadful pantomime repeated itself. Driven by a compulsion she no longer understood, Ella returned to the hazel tree. She wept again, and again the white bird descended, this time bringing a gown that seemed woven from the twilight itself, embroidered with silver that drank the light from the air around it. It was more beautiful and more terrible than the first. Donning it felt like wrapping herself in the coming night, becoming a piece of the darkness. The slippers that accompanied it were silver, and they too were utterly silent. She was becoming more and more a creature of the uncanny, a beautiful phantom slipping between the worlds of the living and the dead. Her return to the festival was met with an even greater fervor. The prince, his obsession now sharpened by her previous escape, was waiting for her. He did not let her out of his sight for a moment, his grip on her hand tight, his smile strained with a desperate possessiveness. He was no longer just fascinated. He was enraged by her elusiveness. He saw her not as a potential bride, but as a challenge to his authority, an exquisite prize that dared to evade his grasp. The ballroom now felt like an arena, and she was the spectacle, pinned in the center by the force of the prince's will. Her silence, which had once intrigued him, now seemed to infuriate him. When the time came to leave, her escape was even more fraught with peril. The prince had anticipated her flight, and as she darted toward the gardens, he gave chase. She scrambled into the branches of a great pear tree, its leaves providing a temporary shroud of darkness. From her perch, she watched in horror as the prince, frustrated and enraged, called for an axe. He was ready to chop down the entire tree to get to her, to claim his prize from its hiding place. It was a moment of chilling clarity. His desire was not love, but a brutal need to conquer and own. She was an object, and he would break her hiding place to pieces to retrieve her. On the third and final night, the offering from the grave was the most breathtaking and horrifying of all. The gown shimmered with the light of 1,000 captured stars against a fabric as black as the void, and it felt as cold as the space between worlds. The slippers were no longer silver or moonlight, but solid gold, heavy and precious, like miniature coffins for her feet. As she wore them, she felt a profound sense of doom settle over her. This was not a costume for a ball, but regalia for a sacrifice. She was being adorned for the end, a final terrible transaction that was now moving toward its inevitable conclusion. The prince, determined to ensnare his quarry, had resorted to a hunter's crude and effective methods. He had ordered the entire grand staircase leading from the ballroom to be coated in a thick black layer of sticky pitch. It was not a romantic gesture to slow a departing lover. It was a trap, plain and simple, designed to catch and hold her like an animal caught in tar. The glistening dark staircase reflected the torchlight like a river of obsidian, a path from which there would be no easy return. It was a physical manifestation of his obsessive will, a sticky, inescapable snare laid for the ghost who had haunted his festival. As the clock began its inexorable chime toward midnight, Ella fled for the last time. She ran, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the golden slippers surprisingly agile on the marble floors. But as she reached the staircase, her foot plunged into the viscous pitch. The trap held her fast. In a moment of pure animal panic, she had a choice: struggle and be caught, or abandon a part of herself to the darkness. Without hesitation, she wrenched her foot free, leaving the perfect golden slipper behind, a single gleaming trophy swallowed by the black, grasping tar. She vanished into the night, but she had left a part of her story in his hands, a tangible clue that would lead the hunter directly to her door. The arrival of the prince at her home was not a moment of romantic reunion. It was a grim, methodical procession. He carried the golden slipper on a velvet cushion, but his face was not that of a hopeful lover. It was the stern, determined face of a man pursuing a claim. The stepmother presented her eldest daughter with a triumphant flourish, her smile a grotesque mask of avarice. The girl, coarse and fleshy, thrust her foot forward, but it was a fool's hope. Her foot was too broad, too common, to fit into the impossibly delicate slipper. She grunted and strained, her face turning purple with effort, but the slipper would not yield. It was then that the stepmother's mask of civility fell away completely, revealing the monstrous core beneath. Leaning in close to her daughter, her voice was not a shout, but a cold, clinical whisper that was far more terrifying. "Cut off your toe!" she commanded, her eyes as flat and lifeless as chips of slate. "When you are queen, you will have no need to go on foot." From the folds of her dress, she produced a small, wickedly sharp paring knife. There was no hesitation, no flicker of maternal concern, only the calm, rational instruction of a butcher advising on the best cut of meat. The transaction was clear, a small piece of flesh for a lifetime of power. From her hiding place in the shadows of the scullery, Ella watched, a silent, horrified witness to the unfolding atrocity. The daughter, her face a mask of pain and ambition, took the knife. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but a single, unblinking glare from her mother was all it took. With a choked sob, she placed the blade against her own flesh and pushed. The sound was sickeningly intimate, a wet, tearing sound followed by a sharp, dense crunch as the steel severed the bone. A muffled scream was swallowed by a clenched jaw, and a gush of dark, hot blood instantly soaked her white stocking, the shocking crimson blooming like a corrupt and terrible flower against the pristine fabric. The hobbling, maimed girl presented her foot, now forced into the golden prison of the slipper, and the prince, none the wiser, lifted her onto his horse. But as they rode past the hazel tree, the doves that served as her mother's grim sentinels cried out in a clear, chiming chorus, "Look back! Look back! There's blood on the track! The slipper's too small, she's not the right bride at all." The prince glanced down and saw the truth. The delicate slipper was overflowing, a steady stream of thick red blood dripping from its heel onto his pristine saddle. His face, once hopeful, twisted into a mask of pure revulsion. He turned his horse around without a word, the dream of his ethereal princess dissolving into a bloody common fraud. The second daughter was then brought forward, her face pale with a mixture of hope and terror. Her foot, like her sister's, was too large, her heel too robust and wide to fit within the slipper's narrow confines. The stepmother, her expression unchanged, performed the same cold ritual, the same whisper, the same knife, the same monstrous command. "Cut off your heel," she instructed, her voice devoid of any human warmth. A small pain for a great throne. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and the suffocating tension of this repeated act of ritualistic butchery. This was not a fairy tale fitting. It was a pagan sacrifice on the altar of ambition. Ella watched this second act of self-mutilation, and the last vestiges of her fantastical, childish hope shattered into dust. The sound of the knife slicing through skin and gristle, the muted, agonized gasp of the second sister, it was the sound of her own foolish dreams being butchered. The prince was no savior. He was merely a buyer inspecting livestock and recoiling when the product was damaged. He wasn't searching for love. He was hunting for a perfect, unblemished trophy to adorn his court. This was the moment of her true awakening. The world was not a place of good and evil, but a marketplace where everything and everyone had a price. The blood that pooled in the slipper for a second time was a horrifying revelation. It was not just the blood of her stepsisters, it was the blood of her innocence. She understood then that the castle was just a grander, more opulent version of her own home, a gilded cage where cruelty was simply better dressed. The stepmother's sadism, the sister's desperate ambition, the prince's callous objectification, they were all threads in the same brutal tapestry. She was trapped not by a single wicked woman, but by a world that saw beauty as a commodity and bodies as things to be measured, altered, and discarded. There was no clean escape, no magical rescue. There was only the transaction. As the prince returned, his face now a thunderous mask of fury and disgust, the stepmother's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. He demanded to know if there was another daughter, his voice laced with the dangerous authority of a king. The stepmother hesitated, her mind racing. To admit to having another daughter was to admit she had lied, but to deny it would be to forfeit the ultimate prize. She tried to dismiss the notion, speaking of a filthy little kitchen wench, a thing of ash and soot, far too wretched to be considered. But her very denial, her venomous description, only served to pique the prince's desperate curiosity. Before Ella could be summoned, her fate was decided for her, but her family, in a final paroxysm of spite, sought to enact one last degradation. Cornering her by the cold hearth, they fell upon her like a pack of wolves. It was not enough that she was unseen, she had to be made unseeable. They ripped and tore at her simple gray dress, shredding the fabric until it was nothing more than a collection of pathetic rags clinging to her frame. Their hands, smeared with grease and soot from the fireplace, clawed at her face and arms, grinding the filth deep into her skin, a brutal baptism into the worthlessness they had always assigned her. This was not merely a physical assault. It was a ritualistic exorcism of her identity. With every smear of ash, every whispered taunt, they sought to obliterate the memory of the girl named Ella and solidify the existence of the creature Aschenputtel. "You are nothing but dirt," the stepmother hissed, her face close, her breath smelling of decay, "a thing of the cinders, fit only to be buried in them. You stink of the hearth. How could you ever dream of touching something so clean as a prince?" They were not just trying to ruin her chances, they were trying to force her to accept their verdict, to look at her own reflection and see only the monster they had created. The prince, his patience finally shredded, his voice now cold with royal command, insisted, "Show me the other one." The stepmother's face was a crumbling facade of civility, her lies turning to dust in her mouth. She was forced to retrieve Ella, dragging her from the shadows into the gray light of the main hall. Ella stood before them, a portrait of perfect degradation. Her dress was in tatters, her skin was a canvas of soot and grime, and her hair was matted with ash. She was the embodiment of everything they had named her, a filthy, wretched thing of the cinders. But through the mask of filth, her eyes were unnervingly still, holding a quiet, unbreakable core of self that their abuse had, miraculously, failed to extinguish. At the prince's gesture, a servant brought a basin of water. The act of washing her face and hands became a quiet, deliberate ritual of reclamation. As the layers of grime dissolved, revealing the pale, fine-boned features beneath, it was as if she were washing away not just the soot, but the identity of Aschenputtel itself. The transformation was shocking. The creature of the hearth vanished, and in her place stood the ghostly princess from the ball. The stepmother and her daughters watched, their faces contorting into masks of disbelief and dawning horror. They had spent years trying to bury Ella under filth, and with a simple splash of water, their entire reality was undone. The prince held out the golden slipper. Ella sat, and with a grace that seemed impossible for one who had lived a life of servitude, she slipped her foot into it. It slid on as if it were a second skin, a perfect, gleaming fit. The prince stared, his expression not of dawning love, but of stunned, almost clinical recognition. He had found it. He had found the missing piece of his puzzle, the rare specimen that had escaped his collection. He looked at her not as a person who had suffered, but as the beautiful, uncanny object of his obsessive hunt. Finally run to ground, his quest was complete. He had captured his ghost. As he lifted Ella onto his horse, the world within the house seemed to freeze. The stepmother and her two daughters stood as statues of impotent fury, their faces pale, their mouths agape in silent screams. Their meticulously constructed world of cruelty and control had not just been challenged, it had been utterly annihilated in a single, quiet moment. All their schemes, their lies, the very flesh they had sliced from their bodies had amounted to nothing. They had lost. And as Ella rode away, she did not look back. To look back would be to acknowledge they still held some power over her, and that power was now a dead and empty thing. The ride to the castle was not a joyous procession. A heavy, unnerving silence hung between Ella and the prince. She was not a blushing rescued bride. She was a survivor being transferred from a familiar prison to an unknown, gilded one. Her face was placid, but it was the profound, empty serenity of one who has witnessed the absolute worst of human nature and has nothing left to fear. Her soul had been scoured clean of warmth, leaving only a cold, hard surface that reflected the world's brutality right back at it. She was no longer hoping for love or kindness. She was simply moving to the next stage of a transaction she now fully understood. Above them, a shadow kept pace with the royal procession. The doves from the hazel tree, her mother's grim couriers, flew in a tight, determined formation. Their soft cooing was gone, replaced by a series of sharp, resonant calls that were not warnings but pronouncements. They were the arbiters of a justice that had long been delayed, a shadow of the grave that now followed her from the ashes of her past into the sterile splendor of her future. They were a promise and a threat. They were the only part of her old life that she was bringing with her, the only part that truly mattered. The debt of cruelty would be paid in full. At the castle, she was stripped of her rags and subjected to the ministrations of a dozen servants. They bathed her in scented water, anointed her with oils, and combed the last of the ash from her hair. They dressed her in silks and velvets so fine they felt like air, a costume of immense value designed to transform the kitchen wench into a queen. But the true transformation had already happened, deep within the marrow of her bones. The finery was just a new mask. Underneath, she was no longer Ella, the victim. She was a vessel for a cold and patient reckoning, an instrument of a justice that had no room for mercy. The wedding was a grand, hollow spectacle, Light streamed through stained glass windows, illuminating the fawning, smiling faces of the court. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and melting wax, a scent that reminded Ella of a funeral. She stood beside the prince, a perfect, silent bride, her beauty so ethereal it seemed almost painful to behold. She played her part with flawless precision, her vows a soft whisper in the cavernous chapel. But as she stood there, robed in white, she was not thinking of her future. She was waiting for her past to arrive, to present itself for its final, terrible judgment. And they came, hobbling down the aisle on their mutilated feet. The two stepsisters made their entrance. Their expensive gowns were a grotesque parody, unable to conceal the broken, limping things they had become. They had come to feast on their sister's good fortune, to insinuate themselves into her new life and reap the rewards of her ascension, their avarice blinding them to the cold fury they had cultivated in her heart. They smiled at her, their expressions a sickening blend of envy and fawning desperation, believing she was still the same weak, forgiving creature they had left in the cinders. This was their final, fatal miscalculation. Ella met their gaze. Her expression did not change. She remained serene, regal, a queen of ice. She did not need to speak, to condemn, or to lift a finger. In her eyes, they saw no flicker of shared history, no hint of forgiveness. They saw only a mirror, a perfect, cold reflection of their own monstrosity. They saw the truth of what they had done, not to her, but to themselves. And in that moment of horrifying recognition, as they stood paralyzed before the altar, they heard a sound from above, the sharp, sudden beating of 100 pairs of wings. The air in the chapel turned cold. The light from the windows seemed to dim as a great, dark cloud descended from the rafters. It was the birds. They were not the gentle doves of storybooks, but a screeching, vengeful swarm, their eyes like chips of obsidian, their coos transformed into battle cries. They fell from the sky not like birds, but like stones, a living avalanche of feathers and fury. Their wings beat the air with a sound like tearing silk, and the wedding guests screamed, stumbling back in a wave of panic and terror. This was not a miracle. It was an execution. The attack was swift, brutal, and terrifyingly precise. The flock ignored the panicked crowd. Their entire collective rage focused on two targets. They swarmed the stepsisters, a whirlwind of gray and white, their beaks moving like tiny, flashing daggers. It was a methodical, vicious assault. The sisters' screams were high and thin, lost in the cacophony of screeching birds and panicked guests. The flock targeted their faces, their beaks pecking and tearing with relentless surgical accuracy. Blood sprayed, and the sisters fell, clawing at their own faces as the birds, agents of a deep and ancient rage, plucked out their eyes. When it was over, the birds vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene of absolute horror. The two sisters writhed on the marble floor, their finery soaked in their own blood, their hands clutching the ragged, empty sockets where their eyes had been. Their screams of agony echoed through the now silent chapel, a soundtrack to Ella's victory. The celebration was shattered, the illusion of a happy ending ripped to shreds and replaced by the raw, visceral truth of vengeance. The wedding guests stared, frozen in horror, at the beautiful young queen and the carnage that had been wrought in her name. This was her triumph, absolute and terrible. She had escaped. She had won. But it was a cursed victory, purchased at the cost of her own humanity. As she watched her tormentors stumble blindly, screaming for a light they would never see again, She felt nothing, not pity, not joy, not remorse. The place inside her where those feelings once lived was a hollow chamber, scoured clean by years of abuse and filled now with a cold, silent emptiness. The fire of her suffering had not forged her into something stronger. It had simply burned away her soul, leaving behind something hard, beautiful, and unbreakable. Now you know. You know the story is not about a slipper, but about a knife. It is not about a wish, but about a debt. The evil was not vanquished by a fairy's wand. It was answered with a justice as pitiless and unflinching as the cruelty that had birthed it. The final image is not of a princess living happily ever after, but of a queen, robed in splendor, her face a mask of serene beauty, as her sister's screams echo in her memory. She is safe, she is powerful, but she is forever a creature of the hearth. The cycle was not broken. The debt was merely paid in blood. The ash, you see, never truly washes off.